Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 18th of May. Today we're doing another recap video going over news from the past couple of days, but this time it will be more brief as I'm going to focus less so on the order of battle. I think I've really exhausted that subject and focus more on some of the changes, especially around Lyptsi, Vovchansk, then going further south around Chasiv Yar and Avdiivka, and lastly Robotyne. So all of that will be segmented so you guys could click on whatever part of the video you're interested in. Let's begin by looking at the Lyptsi Axis, where the Russian forces have continued with their advances, and they're doing so along a very specific vector of attack, which makes sense from an elevation perspective. So I'll explain that. So we know that around the 13th of May, the Russians solidified control over Hliboke, and since then they've made forays further south. At this point, we know that they've advanced at least about 3.5 kilometers southwards, specifically along this paved road that you could see starts east of Hliboke and then goes south into the northern outskirts of Lyptsi, and so it makes sense to advance around the direction. But you could still see there is uncertainty about the northern dachas of Lyptsi, because that again is on the western flank of that road and it's pretty close to Hliboke. And there's still no verified video proof of Russian forces taking this area over, although I'm aware that over the past couple of days, Russian sources have put the front line somewhere around here, and so just know that's what they're claiming. But we have this video which was from the 15th of May, so it is a bit old by now, and so the lines could have changed by then. But what it shows is Ukrainian forces clearing out a house on the northern edge of these dachas, which had several Russian soldiers inside, and they took 2 Russian POWs from the 11th Tank Regiment, which we discussed previously, being active over here. So not only does this regiment have its own tank and armored assets, but it has these motorized forces that are operating here and conducting the advances. And so what we know for sure is that based on videos from Ukraine's 42nd Mechanized Brigade, specifically their Perun drone units, the Russian forces have been able to make these gains through forested areas and open fields towards the northern outskirts of Lyptsi. So we have this video here which shows the Russian preparations for the advance, which included aerial strikes. Of course, we had a lot of those, especially on the first day of the Russian opening of this front, and in the subsequent days, very heavy FAB bombings, and of course artillery. Here we have an FPV strike which hit a Ukrainian held trench, and as has been covered by a lot of people already, you could see in that video dozens if not hundreds of dragon's teeth that were just discarded on the road, so they won't really have any meaningful impact in stopping Russian vehicles, as they weren't put into any sort of organized formation. And that then goes again to the topic of Ukraine not being fully prepared in constructing their defenses over here, not just when it comes to digging trenches, but also in terms of coordinating that and putting in dragon's teeth along this road. And so now the Russian forces will just be able to bypass through this area, and they already took over that trench. And then further south, this is again airstrikes, and then here the confirmation of the deepest Russian advance. You see it's a 4-kilometer advance, and it's Ukrainians shelling them and launching FPV strikes onto the Russian forces in these trenches and tree lines. And you can see how the Russian forces are pretty close to these various defenses that were built on the northern perimeter. And so for now, the Ukrainians do hold most of the town, but there is an issue in terms of elevation, because Lyptsi, if you look at where it's located, it's basically at this crossroads between 3 different floodplains that are created by various ponds and rivers. So you have one that goes to the northwest, northeast, and then to the south. And so it's located on very low elevation, being at this crossroads. And the Russian forces, they chose to advance along this vector just to the east over here, which is located on this higher elevated area. I guess if you mark it, it just sort of goes to the northeast like this. And so this entire area is on a ridge overlooking the Ukrainian positions on these floodplains. And then the Ukrainians, to a certain extent, also have some hills in the region that they still maintain control of, including one that goes along the road, the horizontal road connecting Lyptsi to Vesele, and then also goes further to the northeast over here. And it also, of course, is located to the east of these 3 villages in Zelene, Niskuchne, and Vesele. And so the Ukrainians, they are trying their best to hold on to this area in order to prevent the eastern flank of Lyptsi from falling. At that point, the Russian forces would have control of all the predominant heights in the region, and there would be much more pressure on Lyptsi. At the same time, besides the fact that the Russians control the hill over here. They are getting increasingly close to the horizontal road connecting Lyptsi to Vesele, which is important for the frontline connectivity. They're 3 kilometers away. You could see that the Ukrainians, they're trying to set up a temporary defense line over here. You can see some of the trenches that were built previously, and it is thought to be a solid line, just this horizontal line that could prevent the Russian forces from exploiting their advances. But now the Russian forces are getting very close to this area, and that could jeopardize the connectivity, could jeopardize the defense of areas deeper into the front line like Vesele, and use those paved roads for further advances. And so it is an issue. And that's why you have reinforcements from the 42nd Mechanized Brigade, and then you have active drone operations from the Omega Group. Their second detachment is operating over here on the Lyptsi direction. And just as one further clarification, I previously had Zelena marked as under Russian control, but it was always under Ukrainian control. That's my belief. There's no proof saying otherwise. And so that's important because Zelena, although it is located in a valley to the west and to the east, there are hills that Ukraine still controls and are critical in order to prevent the Russians from overlooking towns such as Vesele and the various other chains of towns on river valleys. Now let's move on to the Vovchansk Axis. So I am well aware of the claims that came out from Russian sources starting around 16th of May of the capture of Staritsia. We just don't have any proof yet of this advance. We do know that over the past few days, footage has come out showing the main intelligence directorate. Some of their special forces have been sent across the Donets River to defend this village. And in one such video of their operations, they showed small arms fire combat, fighting within the forest, and then they also destroyed a Russian BMP within the AT4. And so that's a couple of days old. So of course, the situation could have changed, but we don't have any proof to the contrary. But what we do know for sure, based on Ukrainian reports and of course the geolocations that came out several days now, is that Vovchansk is under full Russian control, and the Ukrainians have withdrawn from most of their positions that are north of the Donets River. The only one that's still in question, as I said, is around Staritsia. But you could see how, for instance, this forested region over here is now in the gray zone, and how even some of the areas south of Orhirtseve in this forested region are now a gray zone, as the Ukrainians are trying to reach a position that is more connected and more unified, and they're forced in the process to abandon some of their forward holdings that are just too dangerous and too stretched out to maintain. And that will have ripple effects, of course, on the flanks of Vovchansk, because now the western flank is undermined if the Russian forces could cross over and occupy positions using the concealment of the forest south of Hatyshe. And then again, that has implications for the various villages that are south of the Donets River, which would give the Russians access to this very important paved road south of Vovchansk. But that's looking further into the future, because that paved road and the various chains of towns that are essentially in this entire region, they lead to Stary Saltiv, and then to a greater extent to the various highways further south. But looking specifically at Vovchansk, where the Russian forces have intensified assaults over the past week, we know that on the 14th of May, the Russians got a pretty large foothold within the northern perimeter. And over the next few days, they fought in the industrial zone, including the butter facility, I think, the meat processing plant. They got control over all those buildings, and they advanced especially through this western axis over here. And they also advanced along the main road, but to a lesser extent. We know based on this footage from a couple of days ago, I think on the 15th actually, that's when the Russian soldiers were filled inside the Vovchansk hospital, which was a pretty significant advance because, again, it is through a urban area. You have various houses that had to be crossed through, and so in total it was 700, 800 meter advance southwards. And you had Ukrainian forces from the RDK, so those Russian units that were involved in the raids, and also from the main intelligence directorates. They're really at the vanguard of trying to push back this Russian assault. So they've been involved in a lot of the anti-tank operations, also drone operations, but you have an amalgamation of groups doing that. And of course, just small arms fire. And so there's some footage of that. You have the Stugna group, which is a part of the Timur special units of the GUR fighting in Vovchansk. They were filmed near this hospital area. And then there's another film from a couple of days ago, I think from the 14th, of a squad from the GUR filming themselves in front of high school number 2. And so we know that even a couple of days ago, their forward positions where they were filming themselves were not at the northernmost outskirts of Vovchansk. They were actually closer to the Vovcha River crossing. And then you see that crossing is very important because that gives you access to most of the village. You could say like 70% of it. And that's what the Russians are trying to do, first clear out this northern district, which they're in the process of doing. And that's being aided by the fact that they were able to conduct the 700-meter advance and hold on to it for the past couple of days. We do know that the Ukrainians actually today, they responded by hitting the hospital that likely had Russian forces in it even today. And they did this likely using the ground-launched small diameter bomb GBU-39. So they launched that and caused significant damage to the building itself. And then looking further east, there were additional Russian advances confirmed, you could say 200-meter advance southwards. And this was verified based on footage from grenade drops by the Ukrainian side on Russian infantry in these houses. What's interesting is that we're seeing a lot of the videos coming out. We know already that the 57th Motorized Brigade is active here. What's new is that the 71st Jaeger Brigade is now operating here. Jaeger Brigade, this one, I think it was originally around Vuhledar, and then it was moved to the Avdiivka area just a couple of months ago, actually, to deal with some of the Russian advances post Avdiivka and then around Cheritina. And so I think this is the only unit that I've tracked so far that at least had some of its elements, maybe just one battalion, moved to the Vovchansk area to fight. And so that is a pretty interesting development. So they're pretty active around here. We do know that the Russian forces also have a smaller vector of attack going on just to the east of Vovchansk. We have over here a video of Ukrainian border guard, I think it's the 16th of May, preventing 5 Russian soldiers from crossing over the Vovcha River. And that, again, based on where he was firing towards, verifies that the Russian forces basically reached the Vovcha River along this particular paved road. And so the Russian forces have a foothold now in this eastern outskirts, including in the village of Tikhe over here. And that is a threat because depending on the Ukrainian composition of forces, they may not have that many stationed over here. And so there's an open question about how many are really on the flanks. Because crossing over this river over here, I think it's the Vovcha River over here, crossing over it means that the Russian forces would only be 1.1 kilometers away from the key road, this horizontal road. This road, it's very important in the sense that it connects Vovchansk to this chain of villages that are just really interconnected, going all the way to the northeastern border between Ukraine and Russia, and it's one of the only chain of towns on this border region. And then going south, there's like 10-15 kilometers of just open fields. And so these positions for the Ukrainians are just very exposed because all of them are in a valley. And then you have Russian interfluves overlooking them to the north. And then the Ukrainians, I guess you could say the silver lining is that they have some pretty high elevated positions in this ridge over here that starts around Bili, Kolidyaz, and then goes further south like Lazova in this general area. And so the Ukrainians also have some hills over here, but then all of this border region that the Russians are now getting control over, it overlooks the chain of towns, especially overlooking Vovchansk, which is rather low elevation because the Vovcha River basically bisects it. And then you look at the river crossings, the Russians destroyed one crossing already, which is pretty close to where the hospital is located. And then there's another crossing which I'm not sure about its fate, and so that could be utilized by the Ukrainians to withdraw and then potentially by the Russians to cross over. Looking at the Kupyansk front, the Ukrainians moved several units away from this axis due to it being relatively close to Kharkiv, and so when they really needed immediate reinforcements, some of them were moved in from this region. And that had the role of then giving the Russians a window of opportunity to attack here. That's what they did several days ago. They advanced north of Kislivka and captured a fairly small amount of territory as per deep state. I guess you could say 1 kilometer to the west, taking over additional territory along this hill on the rail line, which overlooks the Ukrainian positions in Stepove, Novoselivka, and Ivanivka. And so these two villages, they are still held by the Ukrainians, although no longer held by the Kraken unit because of its movement to Vovchansk. And so now the Ukrainian 88th, for instance, and some territorial defense units are defending these two final villages that are the vanguard for this highway, because after that point, there really isn't any other village in the way before reaching Petropavlivka, besides, you could say, some of the ditches around Pischane. Moving on to Chasiv Yar, this area has been subject to, I would say, an operational pause throughout the early parts of May, and we only started to see some changes, albeit to lesser extent, around May 10th, and that's when we saw some updates from deep states. And so there's a question as to whether these updates are earlier events that occurred, earlier Russian advances along the T0504 highway and along this forested area to the west of Avdiivka. But based on now mapping that's confirmed by both sides, the Russian forces have additional control of this nature reserve, including positions around Baba Hill in the region, and they're just gradually solidifying control of this forested region to the east of the Donbass Canal, already making initial forays into the canal, into the pipeline area, really around the end of April, beginning of May. And since then, there hasn't been any radical shift toward west. And you did have some engagements with Ukrainian forces, Russian drone crews targeting Ukrainian vehicles. I think they started with infantry fighting vehicle around here. And then there's an open question about the control in this northwestern corner of the forested region, because some Russian sources claim it's under their control. Although for now I'm still marking it as a gray zone, because this area is very important, because basically taking it over would mean the Russian forces do have full control of the eastern crossing, basically, of this land portion of the canal. And the way the water is transported is through two pipelines, and I think there's like two trenches that were dug under the pipelines. And so some Russian forces were spotted in that area previously, a couple of weeks ago. And it is a physical crossing that could be utilized to go westwards and just embed the Russian forces within some of these forests in eastern Chasiv Yar. Of course, a vector of attack through that area would be extremely difficult, but at least in terms of some forward scouts, that is certainly possible. Then looking further north, we have additional movement of the Russian side, just short clips of an armored vehicle of the Russian forces just advancing along this road towards the canal district, although there's no footage of it actually entering inside. Further north, we do have confirmation from the 41st Mechanized Brigade, a Ukrainian unit, showing their FPVs and drones dropping grenades onto the advancing elements of the 98th VDV Division in the forested area to the northeast of the canal district. And so, they're taking over positions in those dugouts in the forest, but also within the dachas. And that is, again, in order to squeeze out, by all means, the Ukrainian elements that are holding over here, that have held for several months now, without doing these head-on assaults. And so just squeezing them and attacking from the flanks seems to be the route the Russians are going with. And you could also see that with attacks further northwards around Kalinina. So here we have a video, which I think is from the 13th or 14th of April or May, and it shows the Rubaki drone group dropping grenades onto Russian infantry squad as they advance along this road to Kalinina. This is one of the benefits the Russians gained from capturing Avdiivka. They got control of this key road, which leads directly into Kalinina, and now the Russian forces are, of course, present on its eastern outskirts. The village itself is really relatively small, but you do have this land crossing to go to the western side of the Donbass Canal and to Chasiv Yar, and so it is important for that reason. It's also on a local height. It's one of the higher regions in the area, overlooking, for instance, Avdiivka, and then that would give the Russians parity in terms of elevation when comparing it to these forested areas and the canal district to the south, which could be flanked as a result. And so that's just part of the Russian thinking in beginning to put pressure in that region. And I would also add that the Ukrainians did move out some elements of their defense in recent days because of the opening of the Kharkiv front, and that includes the 42nd Mechanized Brigade, which was defending around here. And then further south, this has less of an effect, but who knows, maybe there were some elements fighting further north. So you have 93rd Mechanized Brigade and 92nd Assault Brigade that are both had some of their elements moved to the Vovchansk and Lyptsi areas, and that may play a role in the Klishivka area, because Klishivka has been pretty quiet for recent months, but now we're seeing some Ukrainian sources mention a very slight Russian advance, which occupied additional houses on the northern entrance where the rail station is located and around the rail line. Nothing too significant now, but I would say the barometer for which to tell whether Klishivka is in significant danger is whether the Russian forces succeed in overrunning this western flank, because that western flank is where all the hills are located, overlooking the valley on which Klishivka is located. and that's how we could tell if the Russians are serious about taking it over. Moving on to the Avdiivka front, which I think we should rename by now to perhaps the Vovchansk River front, or if we're looking further westward, Selidove or Pokrovsk front. In this region, there has been a decrease in fighting, which is understandable after a really eventful month of March going into April, where the Russian forces were first able to undermine, of course, the western side of Avdiivka and then overrun the defenses that the Ukrainians tentatively set up around Semenivka, for instance, and cross over that river, of course, Berdichi, all of those various battles in those villages, and then from there begin to exploit the advances throughout the late stages of April. And so it did make sense that eventually there would be an operational pause, especially after the exploitation to the northwest around Cheratina. But this does not change the underlying dynamics regarding the attrition that the Ukrainian forces in this region are suffering, the fact that Russia still does have reserves that were never committed to the battle in Avdiivka, and also the fact that the Russians do have the advantage across this entire sector in certain areas in relation to elevation, which is now a part of why they're beginning to advance over this past week. And so I'm going to focus on the southern sector of Avdiivka because of the north, there really isn't any change of note. But beginning around Umanske, over here, it's mainly DPR forces that are conducting the advances. We know that based on footage from May 14th, that the Russian forces were continuing to move in reinforcements to Umanske, which they had already had a foothold in for about 2 weeks. And this is again verified on geolocations of Russian infantry squads being hit by Ukrainian FPVs in Umanske. And so there was a movement, and the reason why this movement was even facilitated is because I think it was also 2 weeks ago, the Russian forces crossed over the river over here. They got control over this paved road and the trenches to the west of it and used that as a route to then send in dozens of men into Umanske. And so over the past week, the Russian forces have gotten control over, I guess you could say, most of the village, if not all of it. And this is further verified based off of this footage that came out, I think, on the 17th of May from the Ukrainian side, showing 11 FPV strikes on Russian vehicles and troop clusters in the fields that are just to the south of Umanske. In one geolocation was particularly close to Umanske's western outskirts. And so it appears the Ukrainian forces in that region, which I think would mainly be composed of the 59th, or not 59th, but the 53rd Mechanized Brigade and the 25th Airborne Brigade. They were pushed out either to the northwest, where the Ukrainians do have some area, some breathing space, several kilometers of just open fields, and then going to Skuchnia and this entire line around the Vovchansk River. And then some were also forced out to Yazor which is a very difficult area to defend, as we're going to get to. And the Russian forces just continue to get control over this vertical road, which leads from Umanske into Netelove, into an area where the Russians now control. And so even today, we got additional information of Russian advances based on a Alaster video. Alaster is a group of drone specialists within the 25th Airborne Brigade. So they struck Russian squads in fields east of Yazor, which did lead to Russian casualties. But those videos did verify to us the Russians are now present in this trench system that is supposed to guard the eastern perimeter of Yazor. And now that means the Russians are only, if we measure it, about 1 kilometer to the east of it. And that puts the Ukrainian garrison here in danger, the squads over here. When you look at the routes of withdrawal, it's going to be very difficult for them to withdraw to the northwest just because of how close the evacuation routes are to the front line. And the Russian forces now beginning to solidify control over Romansk would then be able to fire towards them. Same thing with the fact that the Russians control all these hills that are located to the east of Yazor. They're not at an extremely high elevation, but because Yazor is on a floodplain, then there is a mismatch in elevation, and the Russians do get a pretty clear view of the village. And so the other route is this 300-meter wide crossing past the Karlivka Reservoir. And this is difficult because, of course, it is just one crossing, and then moving over resources, men, and equipment to the west in a short period of time could be difficult. It could become a choke point where the Russians concentrate their fire and leads to Ukrainian casualties. And this entire region along the Vovchansk River is, again, on lower elevation, so the Russians will have a pretty good view as they're targeting these regions. But then once we get to the west, past the Vovcha River, the Ukrainians do control various ridges that are also defended by these strong points that the Ukrainians constructed to defend any sort of Russian push west of the Vovcha River. And so that would be the silver lining for the Ukrainians. And then looking further south, we have additional advances of the Russians within the Telove. It's basically fully under their control. This was verified by a video of Ukrainian drones dropping grenades and FPVs attacking Russian house in the Telove. It was a 500-meter Russian advance. And then further south, we have a video from, I think it's like a week ago now, and it shows work of the drone crews of the 59th Motorized Brigade on these Russian positions in southern Telove, targeting a structure around this warehouse region. And so when it comes to the Ukrainian control in these fields to the east of Vovcha River, the only way that it will be fully removed is by taking over this ridge that basically runs parallel to the E50 highway and is also present within Nevelska. And so there are various scattered defenses, I'd say, but they are still there nonetheless. And they are pretty numerous. They're small, but they're numerous. And so the Ukrainians do still have, in small quantities, a presence in this region, and the Russian forces have not been able to expel them yet, even from these eastern regions. The Russians still need to put an emphasis on clearing them out, and until they do so, it will be difficult to continue advancing westwards. And being able to take over this ridge would give the Russian forces a pretty secure means by which to continue with their advances further north along the E50 highway and begin assaulting the next Ukrainian line of defense, at least putting pressure on it in an area like Karlivka, which is not on high elevation. To the west, there is high elevation, but it is in an exposed region. And so that would put it in danger. And the Russians, as I said before, they have control of this key highway, which you should keep in mind for the future. But before we look at that, or we'll look at that in later videos, here in Krasnohorovka, there have not been many significant changes. We just have really deep state admitting to the reality in this town after several weeks of just leaving most of it in a gray zone and not changing it. And so now their new map depicts much of this industrial region, even going north in the industrial zone, some residential areas being marked under Russian control, and the Ukrainians being squeezed out of the western portions of the village, the southwest. And then around the Novomikhailivka area, there still isn't concrete information about significant changes. We just know that there's been a small Russian advance through this field to the southwest of Novomikhailivka in order to get control of the ridge that overlooks Konstantinivka. But for now, that is a pretty small assault. And lastly, around Robotyne, we have some key changes to make note of. First of all, the 82nd Air Assault Brigade, which was mainly operating to the east of Robotyne around the Verbova region, at least one of its battalions has been moved to defend on the northern border around the Vovchansk region, or Lyptsi. And so now that will degrade the composition of forces in the Orkiv sector. But looking specifically at Robotyne, there has been confirmation of a Russian advance, which puts them in control of the vast majority of the village. So we know this based on the Ronin group. They released footage of the 65th Brigade, because they're part of that unit, FPV strike on the ruins of one house where there was a Russian troop station. And then a bit to the southeast, we have here another video from them of a strike on a basement that the Russians were located in. And so you can see how, in a very small scale way, the Russian forces mainly advancing on these motorcycles. They were able to occupy various positions, ruins, basements within Robotyne, and that was done over a sustained period of time, like a month. And gradually they reached the northern outskirts, and now the Ukrainians have been pushed back to these trenches that were built by the Russians in preparation for the counteroffensive. Now the Ukrainians are using it as a defensive line to prevent the Russians from getting full control of the perimeter. And same thing goes for the eastern side, where there are also some Russian defenses. Some of them may be concealed from above because there are these ground coverings that make it hard for drones to see where the trenches are located. And so you do have Ukrainian forces stationed over there. But in terms of the implications of Robotyne being captured by the Russian side, what this means is that Robotyne itself was actually, for the most part, located on a hill, which overlooks the nearby Ukrainian positions. It does not overlook the highway leading into Orikhiv, although now the Russian forces do have a route to continue advancing along that highway to go further north towards like Novodanilivka, for example. But it does overlook the depression that basically stretches out from Novodanilivka going in the southeastern direction. And so that will put the Ukrainian forces that are currently on the line of contact in the salient that you see over here in serious danger from both flanks. And of course, it's the same thing. You look at the presence of the Russian forces over here in this eastern ridge around Verbove and then now around Robotyne. There is a question about how long the Ukrainians could maintain their defenses in this very small salient, which is just consisted of Russian-built trenches that were scattered, not even at parts of the Surovikin line. Then you look further north, and that's where you have some higher elevation. You have these hills over here around the Balka Uspanivska, and that seems like a logical fallback line. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.